Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you here at the Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts in Ljubljana, and also to welcome everyone who is watching us online on the live stream, on the YouTube, and on the Facebook pages. Today, we are addressing, I think, quite an important topic, maybe unfortunately, and the topic of today's roundtable is Historians and Populism, Regional Perspectives and Entanglements. And I'm very glad to welcome several speakers. We will have today two panels on two relatively different sides of the topic. The first one, which we will start any minute now, is Walking on Eggshells, Historiography in the Populist Context. And I want to welcome here three great speakers on this topic from the younger generation of scholars who have different experiences and also come from different regional and also scholarly backgrounds, or at least the expert fields that they are dealing with. So first, I want to welcome Vita Zalar, who is a research assistant here at the Research Center of Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts. She's writing a PhD dissertation entitled Conceptual History of Gypsiness, Habsburg and Post-Habsburg Perspectives. She also is engaged in working on two research projects. One is at EGGSHELLS in Paris, which is called Dislocations and Resistances, Persecution and Genocidal Violences of Roma, Sinti and Travelers in Western Europe from 1939 to 1946. And the second one is based here in Ljubljana. It's led by Rok Stergar from the Faculty of Arts of Ljubljana University, and it is called Schools and Imperial, National and Transnational Identifications, Habsburg Empire, Yugoslavia, and Slovenia. She was also a visiting researcher at the Hungarian Academy of Arts and also at the University of Graz. And she published also on the topic of conceptual history of gypsiness. The second speaker I want to welcome is Tjaša here, who is a young researcher at the Institute for Contemporary History here in Ljubljana since 1918. And her research interests mostly lie in Second World War and transition years in Slovenia. She holds an MA degree from the Faculty of Arts of University of Ljubljana, where she dealt with women during World War II in Slovenia. And she also published quite a bit on political history of the transition years, as well as on memory politics in Slovenia, especially about remembrance of communism. And she also published on the women's role in parliamentary politics in comparative perspective. She also participated on a research project at her institute entitled Conceptually Political and Cultural Pluralism and Monism in 20th Century Slovenia. And the final speaker I want to welcome here today is Reka Krizmanić, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Imre Kertész Kolleg in Jena. She was also a collaborating lecturer at the University of Leipzig and was a global teaching fellow at the Open Society University Network in collaboration between Princeton University and Central European University. She also works as an external participant on the projects of the Institute of History of the former Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and she published also quite a bit on the role of the Trianon Peace Treaty in late socialist and early transition period in Hungary, both in the context of popular history and historical knowledge production. And currently she's interested in working on state socialist gender regimes in global perspective. So yeah, welcome everyone. And maybe just to quickly explain the format to everyone who is listening. So we will have, both in this panel and in the following panel, about 1 hour of discussion on the panel. And after that, we will have 15 minutes for the Q&A from the audience. It would be, great, whatever questions you have, that we use this time for a fruitful discussion. We will have then a brief break between the two panels. For those of us who are here on site, we will have a coffee break and some croissants. And after that, we will have the second panel entitled Pundits, Megaphones and Marches, Struggles Over Public History, where we will focus less on the academia and more on popular and public history usage in populist contexts. And this panel starts at 11:45 and lasts until 1 p.m. So also for those of you who are online, just so you know, and it will have the same format and be moderated by Vita Zalar. So to start finally with the discussion, I would like to say that this panel mainly focuses on the question of how has historiography as a discipline and as a profession adapted itself to the new populist context in the region. And we would generally like to use this panel to draw some general findings, but also present you with concrete case studies from our context, so from our countries and from the cases that we are familiar with in our work. So maybe I would start with Vita first to ask her how would we actually go about defining populism, because this is something that we've been grappling with in this context. And if you could give us just a general introduction, so to clarify the concept of populism and its link to the crisis of neoliberalism, which many people have done in scholarship and in public debates, and also to the crisis of representative democracy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I will try to explain the concept of populism and how I see it functioning in contemporary scholarly, political, but also everyday discourses from the perspective of historiography, to kind of keep the focus of our roundtable on this topic. So how do populisms relate to contemporary historiography? This generally accepted definition that we have all heard many times, and kind of most political scientists, philosophers, historians working on the topic of populism have kind of converged around, is the idea that populism is the name, the discourse, or even an ideology, a thin ideology, that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous entities, the corrupt elites and the kind of this warm idea of innocent, natural, homogeneous people. So what's interesting about this idea or reconfiguration is that it understands political conflict differently than how our societies, democratic societies, have defined political conflict. So instead of looking at the horizontal line of, let's say, right-wing ideologies versus left-wing ideologies and all of the parties that wish to be kind of in between the two specters, instead of this horizontal line, we are looking at an ideology, which sees conflict in society as happening on a vertical line. So this is a complete reconfiguration of how we look at society, right? We have to point out that this is not a new phenomenon. Populism has actually quite a long history. The term was coined at the end of 19th century in the US context, and was used as a kind of positive self-appellation of self-organized National People's Party, or also called the Populist Party. And this was actually the only and the last successful short-lived attempt in the US context of establishing a third party outside of the binary between Republicans and Democrats. So at the beginning, at its inception, populism is a self-appellation with a positive connotation. The second wave of populisms emerges in the 1960s and 1970s related to decolonial efforts, especially in Latin America. And that is when populism really enters the scholarly scene as well. So we see scholars like Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, Ernest Gellner starting to publish seriously, to think seriously with the concept of populism and trying to kind of define it not only as a term used in the sources, in the political discourse, but also as an analytical tool. But now what's going on in the 21st century is what Marco Revelli, for example, has called the third generation of populisms. And this is our lived and experienced reality right now, and this is what we will actually focus on today in our roundtable. Now, what's especially challenging when we are talking about this third new generation of populisms, first, previous thinkers had to kind of decide where does the crisis, so the symptom of which crises are contemporary populism. So what has gone wrong in our systems, in our representative democracy, that has kind of prompted this overall mood, overall zeitgeist of discontent, of people feeling as if they are living in increasingly precarious situations, of feeling like as if our contemporary political systems, as they function right now, cannot address the sort of everyday anxieties of an average global citizen. So the important novelty of this third new generation of populisms is, of course, that it is for the first time a completely global phenomenon. So right now we can look comparatively at, let's say, contemporary India, South Africa, United States, Hungary, Slovenia, whatever, and we can look for some shared processes, some kind of common denominators. And these, thinkers that have thought through contemporary populisms have kind of converged around the idea that the shared name for our crisis, the crisis of representative democracy, is the, systemic failure of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism as a system, as you know, as an economic system, but also as a kind of approach to conducting politics, is a system that increases inequalities, increases the kind of vulnerability of citizens, promotes privatization of healthcare, privatization of public infrastructure, and so on. So this is kind of the root cause of the actual felt hardships and anxieties. So to conclude, to not be too long, I want to point out that contemporary populisms are always as a mood, so populism as a context, this is how Marco Revelli calls it, populism as a context, as a kind of zeitgeist that surrounds us, is actually a kind of a justified reaction or an understandable reaction to our lived experiences of contemporary political structures not addressing many of our hardships and troubles. However, populism is a kind of a false answer to a correct question. So if we look around and say what's going on, what's wrong with our system, then populism offers the easier, simplified and incorrect answer, and that is you, the people, the undifferentiated, usually an ethno-nationalist community, you are being kind of your sovereignty, your rights are being taken away by corrupt elites or by these so-called surplus populations, which are getting the privileges that are not given to you. So this would be kind of an overview of kind of general attributes of contemporary populisms, and to bring it back to historiography, where I see this kind of contemporary crisis of representative democracy reflected in historiography and how it influences us. In historiography, or in the way public history is used right now in populist contexts, populism functions as a kind of a smoke screen. So it projects false antagonisms onto actual material lived experiences of present and past societies. So it's a kind of a smoke screen which makes our analysis of actual antagonisms, of actual causes of inequality and so on, harder, because our kind of knee-jerk reaction, or the knee-jerk reaction of people who are using history discourses in the public sphere, so politicians, media, and so on, the knee-jerk reaction is to see political conflict in populist terms, so the elites versus the pristine people.
Thank you so much, Vita, really, for this interesting conceptual, entrance to our discussion. And I think there are many, actually, important issues raised, right? And one of those, for me, that was the most striking also was that we saw that many people were taken by surprise, by the upsurge of these populist regimes, especially in America and other places. We could hear that, how can this happen in 21st century, right? Which somehow presupposes that there is some political modernity we should achieve, right? There is something that should be the standard of the 21st century. So there is some temporality to the political systems that we kind of expect to experience, and this feels as a kind of something wrong, right? Something that shouldn't happen, that many people are looking as some kind of return to the more, let's say, primitive ways of political systems or whatever. And this brings me to the question that I wanted to follow up with Jascha, which is actually the question of historicizing those topics that are prominent in the populist discourses. So, we try to relegate them to the past, right? Which is also something, again, playing with this temporality. So trying to say that this is a kind of a solved question, this is a matter of historical, investigation. Whereas actually populism opens up very much some historical or questions for historiography and puts them at the center of the contemporary political discourse. And I think, Jascha, that in your dissertation, you were also dealing with this kind of usages of history during the 1990s, right? In the, context of the breakup of Yugoslavia and the making of independent Slovenia and so on. So maybe you can tell us about these relationships or usage of history in this context.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, this was like a very common notion in Slovenia for all of the contested history in the public space. Let's just leave history to historians, and they will deal with it. And we as a public, we don't want to have anything to do with it. But of course, now with populism, we saw it's not that easy, because even if today we could decide to just leave everything to one side, it still wouldn't work. We would still like need years to raise the level of public debate back to what it was. So this is like you said, this temporality, this is like a very interesting element of the current populism that I think we are experiencing at the moment. I think now in Slovenia we have this very flattening of time, I would say. So we have this events from the early transition period. So by that I mean 1989 to maybe 1991, 1992, so the time of Slovenian independence, and this is like a very strong nationalist moment in Slovenia. And it comes up in the most like unusual places, I would say. For example, now we saw the war with Ukraine, and we had these very interesting reactions from people who actually were very active at the time of Slovene independence and are still more or less active today. First of all, of course, Janez Janša, who actually went to visit Ukraine in the middle of March. He was like a major figure during the Slovene independence. And he actually was supposed to kind of bring this message of European support to Ukraine. And more than that, I saw two reactions that really kind of made me smile in a way. So the first one was from Dimitri Rupel, who was also a very prominent political figure in the early transition period and also later. And he actually said that it's a very good way of showing support for Janša going to Ukraine, because Slovenes, and that was like his idea, not mine, but that Slovenes, have this very precious experience with Yugoslavia, who attacked them. So we have like this outside enemy, and we were victorious at that time, And now we have some supposedly have some this information, analysis, experience, advice that we can give to Ukrainians, to Ukrainian politicians, not so much the people, I think. to kind of help them against Russia, Putin's Russia. So that was like the first comment, and it was like the textbook populism almost. You have first this flattening of two historical narratives into the present time, you know, that clearly does not hold water for historians, you know, we were all just like a bit shocked. But it's a very easy narrative to follow also. This is, I think, the populist moment. And we also were witnessing this personal action of politicians instead of, you know, kind of trusting the power of institutions that we have in place. I know that is also a critical topic to discuss in it by itself. But still, I saw a lot of this support from Slovene people, you know, he went there in person, those people like exposed themselves to danger, you know, so this was like some added value, I think, in this situation, politically speaking. And it was really easy to construct the enemy again, or to remind the Slovene people who is the enemy, because I think, and this is not just my view, you know, we have a lot of social scientists and sociologists and others who are kind of deconstructing this populist moment in Slovenia. And who is the enemy in this case? It's still socialism, or maybe even communist elites, like we said, we have this, you know, the other is always the elite, you know, and we have this kind of narrative that the socialist elites or communist elites, they still exist in Slovenia. So it was kind of easy to remind people, you know, you see what happens, you know, we still have this enemy within us, you know, or an outside enemy with Putin's Russia. So I think that was the first reaction that kind of brought together all of these different, you know, tiny pieces of populism and just like express this moment in a way. And then the second comment was from Lojze Peterle, again, a very prominent politician during the early transition period, also Janša sympathizer, and he also wanted to publicly express support for Janša's visit to Ukraine. And he said a very similar thing, right, that the transition basically is still not finished because we still have some leftist, even center-left parties or thinkers in Slovenia. So as far as this kind of leftist thought survives in Slovenia, the transition is not finished, right? So this is, again, like a political shift, or at least an attempt to make it. So yeah, that's why I think basically historians here have a unique position, right? We can historicize statements, events, processes. So I think that this kind of would be our job in this case.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And maybe just to follow up also on what you were saying, in the 1990s, right? So in this, you know, moment leading up basically to the war, I mean, or leading up to the breakup of Yugoslavia rather, what were some, you know, like in historiography, how could we see what were the topics that were kind of, I wouldn't say anticipating, I don't want to be, you know, teleological about this, but what were the topics that were occurring or recurring and that kind of showed this shift, you know, towards what would ensue?
So historiography, I think at the early transition years, it was quite fast to react, I mean fast, relatively speaking, but I think we had the first publication in 1992, kind of already depicting this in a very nationalistic way, the way of the Slovene nation that finally got its nation state now. So it was like everything that happened in the past had to be rethought, because obviously now we have the end result, which is the independent nation state. The interesting thing for me was that this was only like a part of historians who advocated for this kind of approach, and they were like also publicly supported, I think, by some media. You know, it was just in tone with the climate in general. But then was this other part of historians who kind of went against this, you know, okay, of course we are always marked by the present to think about the past, but we do not have to use it, you know, in a political way to kind of say, okay, now what 1,000 years of Slovene history has come to an end. This is like very Fukuyama thing to say, I think. But yeah, we can rethink some topics, some events, but you know, we still have to be very conscious of the historical kind of restraints or criticism that we have to apply to it. So there was actually a public debate between Slovene historians in Delo, which is a Slovene newspaper. They have like this literary column in 1993. and they were like debating, also heavily criticizing each other sometimes, about what historiography should look like now in the 90s, you know, now that we are joining Europe finally. So this was another narrative, you know, back to Europe. And it was like a really interesting discussion about, you know, should we do our national history in a way that it was done like basically in the 19th or 20th century when other nations actually formed themselves, or should we kind of, again, play with this temporality, kind of skip forward and just see what is going on in European or foreign historiography at the moment and just try to follow that. So that was it was really interesting to see. So I would say after that, you know, we had a few years of kind of breaking the bubble and seeing what would be possible to do. But then actually we have this, I would say, polarity between historians that kind of reflects also the political space of the 90s. And I would dare to say that there were not as many new changes brought to Slovene historiography in the 90s and even maybe to early 2000s. So it took a bit longer then to actually accept some of the new approaches and to kind of get in touch with also other academic spheres. Not that it wasn't like that before, but, you know, to actually rethink for ourselves what is this new Slovene historiography?
And to go beyond, I guess, the tendencies that you described about, you know, historicizing Slovenian nationhood in a different way. Okay, and now I think we could move to Reka, and I think what would be an interesting kind of connection between what Tjaša was just saying would be actually this, you know, question basically of, we could say, epistemic or expert authority, because you were now saying, you know, political discourses versus discourses in historiography, in scholarship, and so on, that, you know, they were kind of very much influencing each other in dialogue or confronted at different points. And something that many people have, you know, kind of characterized populism with are actually these anti-intellectualist stances, right? I mean, something that we oftentimes go around expert authorities. We oftentimes rely on, you know, like, personal memories or what other people tell us about history and so on. So maybe, Reka, I would ask you in that sense, how do you see this proliferation of non-professional historiography, basically, especially in Hungary, but also other cases?
Yes, so these were my thoughts exactly. So now that I shift a little bit the focus to the Hungarian case, I think we can talk about the importance of the populist context, but this needs to be somehow complemented with both this larger context of the crisis of expertise and its very specific confluences with the populist moment, and also with illiberalism. So at some points when I'm going to address some characteristics of this new regime of historical knowledge production that I would say dates back to 2010 in the Hungarian context. These are layers that should all be kept in mind. And maybe one more thing, just to tie back again to Jascha's contribution. I was somehow struck in my research with to what extent this anti-communist / anti-intellectual, which in many contexts you cannot really disentangle, so how important this label remains, even though it is very poorly defined, and usually it defies common sense. So basically it's a straw man in many ways. What I found when I somehow tried to understand what happened since late socialism, so since the 1970s and 1980s until today in Hungarian historiography, is that the institutional shift that one would have expected must have happened somehow around the democratic transition. Actually, it was much smaller in scale compared to the early 2010s, so basically the second term of Viktor Orban. So you had a lot of personal continuities over the transition, and for generational reasons, you still have some active historians who used to be doing, most importantly, contemporary history. On the other hand, obviously, you have the new generations coming. So in the early 2010s, you could see, in a way, the institutionalization of memory politics masqueraded as historiography. I know this is a strong statement, and I immediately want to qualify it in the sense that this doesn't mean that all the newly funded institutions are being populated with non-professional historians. What I would rather say is that this is a really a mixed bag, both when we compare these new institutions with each other and when we try to compare them with the so-called traditional institutions. We can also see that very powerful memory entrepreneurs are in the sort of the background of these institutions, and that they are actually very much in collaboration with historians coming from these traditional institutions, resettling in these new ones, very often in leading positions. In my research, I also tried to somehow identify the ways in which this new institutional setting came into being, and I found 3 different kinds of strategies with which this very conscious and very much populist memory politics somehow molded this landscape into its own image. So one of them would be the starving out of the traditional institutions. So it's very, very basic financial terms. In Hungary and elsewhere in the region, research institutions are very much dependent on state funding. So if you have a government, especially with the kind of support that you could see in Hungary at the beginning of the 2010s, you really run the risk of actually losing such institutions to them, or just leave them at their mercy. And this is what happened with the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in many ways. And then there's also the closing down or reorganizing of institutions, which is again another way of abusing or misusing this type of power and entitlement that the state seems to feel towards these institutions. So, for example, you have the 1956 archives, which were in an administrative move somehow made part of the National Library of Hungary. But like everyone knew that this is not about budget, this is not about rationalizing anything, but more like the silencing of dissent voices. And then the third most important strategy is obviously this foundation of new institutes. While it would be very tempting to say that these institutions, which are primarily out there to support as a vending machine, Fidesz's sort of memory politics needs and interests, it would be very misleading to see them as, again, as I earlier pointed out, as simply a mix of non-professionals who finally get to do history. On the one hand, there are historians who honestly believe in the need of, again, fighting this communist strawman, and they feel like they are doing the right thing by working for such an institution. And there is another less related side to this story, which is the ever-present academic precarity, which means that you have much more people out there hunting for jobs, and especially with early career researchers, with fresh graduates. Of course, by 2022, you cannot argue that they don't know what they are buying into, but perhaps this is their only chance to actually not be an independent researcher, but have the kinds of formal and informal privileges that come with belonging to such an institution. So this was something that I felt like I need to address, because whenever I go to conferences in Western Europe or in the US and these questions come up, I usually meet with these expectations that I'm expected to confirm that these are simply unprofessional zealots who are somehow serving these purely political purposes.
Thank you. And I mean, it's very nice that you gave this comprehensive, view and these strategies. But maybe to just have a little sub-question and to return, you were mentioning, of course, academic precariat, but also these kind of unprofessional historians engaged in these institutions. So maybe in this context, I would ask you, just to explain to our audience, what is unprofessional about these historians, and what are the topics that are prominent in this? So because I guess there are certain topics that are more prominent than others, so just to kind of outline what are the key debates. Yeah.
Yes, so when I mean unprofessional, I think this can be addressed on two levels. So one of them would be like a very sort of a very easy one. Does one have any kind of education, any kind of background that would somehow equip them with the proper sort of methodological and theoretical toolkit to venture onto doing historical research? And the other would be, I think it's very difficult again to disentangle how people get into this circle of producing historical knowledge simply for the sake of serving certain kind of memory politics. So it can be also treated as a sort of a bad scholarly practice, but also a misunderstanding of the historian's job. And then, of course, you can have still nuances in terms of, okay, but is this person reading their sources, for example, critically, or are they only being picky with choosing the kind of sources so that they could always corroborate the bias question, which is, by the way, a practice that happens in official historiography quite often. So again, I would not want to diabolize in this sense these historians. I think like the more fair way to go about this would be to stick to this very obvious thing. Does one have even a BA or an MA in history or related discipline that would somehow mean some sort of a credit in terms of expertise? But actually, these institutions are very sort of skillful about this. So some of them, for example, the Institute for National Remembrance, which is a region-wide sort of institutional networks part, there you have professional historians, but there are some other parts of these newly funded institutions where you have some people without any sort of a background in it, but then they don't get the same kind of job titles. So usually they are fashioned not as researchers, but as referents, for example, for a given topic. And then just to address very briefly your second question about the important topics, I wouldn't say debates because in the Hungarian public you cannot really see real debate. They are extremely rare, I would say, and some of them are even pseudo debates, so that you know that this is being set up for the very specific purpose of showcasing someone's inadequacy and like showing how the other opinion, the state-endorsed opinion, is actually the good one. So these topics are connected to national grievances, which means usually the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and how this affected the kingdom of Hungary and the long-term repercussions of this. And some of these grievance-based discourses are actually in the making and keep being in the making in a larger dialogue with ventures to create some sort of a European remembrance, and are very much ingrained with this sense of not being understood, being oppressed, and ultimately having to fight the good fight in order to make European decision makers and Western European historians in large to understand Hungary's peculiar but not so peculiar sort of historical experiences, which are very much rooted again in this Hungarian, of course it's a homogeneous ethnic group and the grievances that befell them, and the memory of state socialism, on which this kind of trend of opinions doesn't really welcome any outside sort of takes, because this could only be understood from within the region. So maybe in these sort of regional alliances, there could be some sort of a transnational mutual understanding, but like you could also say that they are fighting the non-understanding of the West with further sort of exclusions. We don't invite you to be part of this conversation because we know how to interpret this and you will never understand that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, these are really good points and a really good insight, you know, for the people who don't know the details about Hungarian case. Maybe to now go to Vita again, to return, what I could kind of connect from this is, of course, you say that, you know, there is this showcasing of, you know, only Hungarians can understand this from the inside and things like that, right? And this, we could argue, is in a certain way identity politics. I mean, you know, in fashioning a certain kind of identity supported by certain kind of visions of history and so on. Here I want to maybe go to, you know, Vita's field of expertise, which is Roma, history of Roma, but also the way they are integrated into, you know, memory politics today in the region, in Central Europe, and so on. So maybe can you outline for us what is the main function, the main role of Roma in European populisms in the region today?
Mm-hmm. So generally speaking, maybe now is a good time to introduce a kind of conceptual difference between left populisms and right-wing populisms. Right-wing populisms, and for our region, if we are talking about actually existing populist projects, not just populism as context, but populism as a project, right-wing populisms are the topic to talk about. So a right-wing populism would, in addition to constructing this binary opposition of the corrupt elites versus the pristine people, would also construct a category below the people. So categories such as immigrants, Roma, Muslims as well, which function as a kind of less powerful opponent in social conflicts and as a very very convenient scapegoat. And the most kind of, how do these affective politics work in the kind of everyday life and experiences of people? The disgruntled majorities of our regions, the majorities that feel kind of their social position, their economic standing kind of slipping away from their hands. They can kind of see that, I don't know, their neighbors are all struggling to pay monthly bills. They can see that their children, even though they're getting highly educated, are not, this is no longer a kind of good strategy for social advancement and so on. So these kind of disgruntled majorities can easily be directed into looking for a scapegoat. This is the easy way out, right? Instead of thinking about the actual reasons for our for social precarity, we are directed to look for scapegoats. And Roma function as the major scapegoats in this region. And after the so-called immigration crisis in 2010s, these two categories of Roma and immigrants have been merged in the kind of general discourse of people. So where can this be measured? I occasionally spend some time on browsing through comments under news pieces related to Roma. And these comments are like, as Tjasa previously mentioned, the metaphor, a textbook example of populist feelings of, let's say, an everyday person in this region. So they would very often point out that Roma are receiving some kind of undue privileges, that they are, that the states and the European Union are protecting them excessively, are giving them too much social welfare. One can read comments such as, in my hometown, only the gypsies are seen leaving the supermarket with full bags. Everyone else has to kind of be very careful with their money. There are people complaining, oh, we saw, you know, a gypsy family buying a new Audi or a new Mercedes, you know, where do they get the money from? They don't deserve this, you know, they're not deserving of being, you know, of having a kind of economic security. So this is a typical kind of populist general zeitgeist, and this can be tapped into so easily by politicians, and we see this in the region. Whenever it's convenient in a pre-elective strategy to shift from having immigrants and Muslims as scapegoats, Roma are like easily utilized. You have seen this, you have observed this in Hungary. We have recently seen this in the Portuguese elections, where the immigrant situation is not a kind of a strong pull enough. So the right-wing populist politicians use this Romaphobia, which is present in the whole Europe, and mobilized it to gain political power. So this is generally how, this is a general kind of atmosphere in which we as researchers are working. And I would say that people who are writing about Romani history and people who work in the field of Romani studies, so also linguists, sociologists, whatever, we are all painfully aware of the danger that people we are interested in as a kind of subject of research, that they are like physically in imminent danger constantly. And then you would see people privately in their private conversations discuss how to write about certain topics to not expose Roma to potential backlash. So certain topics would be kind of omitted or played down. But on the other hand, there are also people who are interested professionally in researching Roma and are totally Romaphobic themselves. Some of them, for example, would use the history of Roma to make a larger point about communism in the region. So in the Hungarian case, Czechoslovak case, some people would write about Romani history during the communist period and point out how the communist regime was oppressing them as a nationality, as an ethnicity, not recognizing them as a national minority. But the larger point to be made there, or the larger point being made there, is look at these kind of uncivilized communist rulers. So it's not about writing Romani history and truly trying to understand the nature of marginalization of Roma in communist regimes. It's about making a point of, you know, look at these communist elites doing whatever they want. They oppressed Roma as they oppressed our grandfathers or grandmothers. So there's this transfer of a victimhood happening. And I think this is a very, very populist approach to writing history. So kind of making parallels between different types of victimhood in very different historical conjuncture and glossing over them, kind of drawing these easy parallels. Yeah.
And maybe just to follow up on one thing that kind of I think is worth exploring in what you just said is that in comparison to other groups that usually, you know, kind of are, let's say, not favorable under in certain populist regimes. I'm also thinking women, but also many others, you know, different, depending on the context, different kind of national minorities, you know, LGBT people, different kinds of things. Roma are in the specific case in the sense that they are oftentimes racialized, right? This is something that in Europe, I mean, or some parts of Europe, at least in our region, they are the one oftentimes that are kind of this racial other. And in terms of historiography, or generally in terms of scholarship, how does this come out? What have you witnessed that has really been kind of a, you know, a vehicle for racializing Roma within the research in populist context in Central Europe?
That's a tough question.
Yeah,
I don't want
because sorry, I know that sometimes, you know, you were also mentioning like genetic research, things like that, that is going on.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a growing kind of flourishing field of genetic studies on Roma. In the past 20, 30 years, like every year, there's at least maybe 15 or 20 articles published by geneticists looking for specificities of, some would even use the term Roma gene or Roma genome. And this, of course, reifies certain ideas of, you know, biological entities, of, you know, it's a move away from all of the kind of theoretical advancements that have been made, had been made in the 1990s in regards to thinking about social construction. And this is, I would, maybe this would be interesting to point out at this point. As I said, people who do research in the field of Romani studies some of them are like hyper aware of potential, or many of us, I would like to say, many of us are hyper aware of potential political backlash that could happen in relation to our research. And one of the topics that has been hotly contested based on this kind of ethical, moral arguments, whether our research can harm or do good to Romani populations, was the question of social construction. And many people have argued that, you know, excessively writing about Romani history in terms of, you know, explaining the social construction of ethnicities, minorities, national groups, and so on, that this is counterproductive to what Romani political movements are trying to achieve in contemporary Europe. So there have been like, and I really appreciate this kind of honest, open debates where people would say, for example, I remember a comment by Colin Clark, a prominent scholar in Romani studies, who wrote at some point, he wrote like a very unfavorable comment or review of a certain edited volume which made explicit use of social construction as a tool to understanding Romani identities in Europe. And he wrote, is now really the time to point out that, you know, Roma, being a Roma is a socially constructed thing as well, is now really the time when we are seeing the French government kind of expulsing European, Romanian Roma from France, when we are seeing people kind of discriminating against Roma also by saying, you know, you don't get the same rights as others because you are not on the same, you are not a nation, you are not on the level of a national minority, you will not be recognized as a national minority. So yeah, there are these very open discussions over what can happen right now in our political scenes, our political realities, even if we are writing about 18th century Romani history, right? So in this field, in Romani studies, the decisions made by historians are kind of felt on a much more personal level, I would say, if I compare it to other fields in historiography that I'm familiar with. And maybe if I have time, I just thought of something else in terms of this kind of populist disgruntlement against, you know, a minority that is getting undue recognition, right? Undue identity politics, undue support. I have talked to some scholars who are actually doing research on Roma, and they themselves are disgruntled about it. Why? We have talked about the growing precarity in neoliberalized academia. And in the European context, it has become kind of easier to get funded to apply with a successful project for European money with an idea connected to Romani populations. And there have been people or whole institutions or research groups who made the conscious decision, okay, we will now go into this topic because it's financially safer. It's a safer option for us. And I have talked to people who have kind of said, you know, now we have to do research on Roma, you know, because this was a top-down decision. It was a kind of money-motivated decision. So it resulted in, you know, people doing research on Roma who are actually very Roma-phobic and also angry about it. So they think that there is a hyper-visibility of Roma, too much money poured into this kind of research, whereas we could, you know, be doing research on, I don't know, some other national minorities or whatever. Yeah. So there's so many different layers of how the crisis of neoliberalism and populism kind of work together in this area.
That's a really, really good point, Vita. Thank you so much. And a really nice kind of slow ending or wrapping up of our panel, because it really is about walking on eggshells, which is the title of our panel, unfortunately. And maybe, you know, in the last just few minutes before we go for a nice break, I would like to just ask everyone for a piece of thought on or some ideas on how to counter these tendencies, specifically in historiographical context. So what do you think would be some kind of viable strategies of going beyond everything that we just mentioned? So, you know, deterioration of institutions, trying to be careful about what we write, trying not to endanger our subjects, or everything that we now mentioned. So just let's say a few ideas, and I think then we can slowly close it and open the Q&A. Yeah. So Tjasa, maybe we can go in this direction. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So for me personally, I had an experience when, for example, I couldn't get to sources that I would need for my research. So that was something that was kind of my last kind of encounter with politics and populism in this sense. So maybe I'm a bit like too optimistic, but I would say that this kind of hardships can also kind of force us to think outside of our frames, to kind of be more innovative, you know, and maybe kind of find other ways, more creative ways to get kind of around the problem, to still get to the source and still kind of are being able to articulate what we want to say. So maybe this is one of the things that kind of we can do. We discuss among each other, you know, these challenges that we are facing. So this would be kind of my idea, to kind of not getting stuck in what we have been doing so far, because obviously it's not working or we have some problems with it, but to just kind of, you know, keep an open mind and maybe embrace also other approaches.
Thank you. Yeah, Reka?
Yes, so a little bit connected to this. I think that the seclusion of expertise in terms of like closing it up in academies of sciences to a great extent, or the universities, is really at the heart of the problem. When I try to somehow see how popular historiography evolved in the Hungarian context, but I could see that this first flourishing, it really happened at the end of the 1970s, where mostly professional historians were very consciously going to like broader audiences, but this was only a tiny fraction of them, because it didn't have any prestige. And sometimes it was even looked down on. And I think that this attitude, this didn't go away. And while it's deeply insecuring to see that one sort of traditional institution is being under attack, while other less clearly historical research type of institutions are being lavishly funded, I think that one of the ways would be really to somehow get rid of this idea of publishing only in very, very remote venues and going to these secluded, tiny professional events and talk there and try to reach out. So this might be done in creative ways, but one doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, right? So especially by now, we have so many technologies, so many types of outreaches that can suit very different kinds of personalities. I think it would be important to somehow reimagine what a historian, especially of contemporary history, should do as a historian, because it is most definitely not what a 19th century historian who's writing good old national history should be doing.
Excellent, thank you. And Vita?
Yeah, I agree with both Reka and Tjasha's points very much. I have to be maybe more concrete or personal. I have noticed that among our older experienced colleagues, historians, many are so reluctant to be in contact with the media, for example. They are often contacted to just offer some kind of historical insight on a certain topic, and most historians I'm personally in contact with just really don't like being exposed to the media. I mean, part of it is also they say I'm not really a total expert on this topic, so I would rather stay quiet. But then this, I mean, the media needs a kind of 30 seconds of some historians saying something about this topic. So then these spaces, we can see, for example, because I'm more familiar with the Slovenian sphere in the media, then we can see the same people appearing, especially in right-wing outlets, media outlets, and repeating some, you know, sometimes even laughable points that could be like really easily prevented if just someone else took the time to, to talk to the media. So that would be one of the possible ways out. And I would also say maybe a more on a more epistemological level, and this is a longer problem of historiography, that sometimes historians tend to analyze our sources in a kind of a spontaneous ideology, as Althusser has called it. So I would call for more theoretical engagement with political theory, sociology, and above all philosophy, to kind of prevent or protect ourselves with the tools developed by people who, I mean, we don't, if we are like thinking about it very practically, a large part of our work, of our time, is dedicated to finding the sources and understanding the sources. Whereas there are disciplines out there and people out there who don't have to, I mean, waste time looking for the sources. They can just sit and think about these processes seriously. So I would say interdisciplinarity in these directions would be very welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for all the insights you gave us and all the points you raised. I think it was quite a productive session. But now let us open the floor for the Q&A. So just raise your hand. A microphone is there. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your talks. I think it was excellent. And I have a question regarding conspiracy theories. Like, it seems to me, and I'm not an expert in any way, but it seems to me that populism, contemporary populism, operates through conspiracy theories. For instance, in Slovenia, for the last few years, the whole right-wing populist discourse constructs itself through the enemy of culture Marxist. Or in America, you have QAnon, and also conspiracy theories, I believe, were a huge part of how the populist discourse around vaccine and COVID-19 pandemics got constructed. So, do you think that these phenomena is connected, or is it a part of populism or populist discourses? And if it is a new thing? Because Vita was talking about 3 waves of populism, so I was just curious about that. And I know this is a very huge question, so I don't expect you to answer it. Just maybe if you have any thoughts on this topic. Thank you.
For the question, any volunteers?
I think there are various types of conspiracy theories, so I could, in the Hungarian context, speak to the historical types of conspiracy theories, which is usually about the great powers, you know, like somehow scheming against Hungary and causing its demise, from which the nation should be led to other victories. So I think in the Hungarian case, you can very easily see how this used to be very much of a far-right sort of pool of ideas to reach into, but as Fidesz gradually co-opted or tried to reach out for the same sort of constituency that this far-right party in Hungary, the former generation of Jobbik, sort of represented, basically they did somehow find their ways into, I wouldn't say the A-list events or the most important messages of the government, but in many outlets and in various fora, you would see them endorsing these kinds of conspiracy theories, and some of these institutions that I mentioned are very openly actually endorsing them. So this kind of making use of historical conspiracy theories, I would say is not a brand new thing, but the scale of it, especially in the media landscape of Hungary, where you can barely get to sort of non-checked news, it's very visible, and the magnitude is something new.
Other responses? Yeah. Maybe I would add, or no, go ahead.
Just a second, just to historicize this question a bit, because I think it's great. There are some examples for Slovene environments that you can see that are now kind of fully blown, these populist topics, very common, but they had kind of some roots in the, of course, early decades. For example, I was thinking about the case of the non-existing Slovene lustration in the mid-1990s. When Janša's party at that time, and also with collaborations from other right-wing parties, they were kind of trying to establish in Slovenia the same lustration process that they had in the Czech Republic. So that was kind of their, they were looking up to the Czech Republic of how they did the lustration. And they were unsuccessful, and they like tried 3 times to push these laws through the parliament. And it was kind of getting unclear for them, why is this not working? You know, maybe they knew why, but they just kind of didn't know how to approach the issue differently in order to be successful. So it actually became just this like an open wound or something that, you know, this never happened in Slovenia. It was a failed project of the 90s for some parties, of course. So yeah, it's just like cases like this that you can see they are kind of piling up through the years, you know, that they kind of get their like coda in the present moment.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, same thing in Croatia, or more or less. But yeah, maybe I just had a small like structural idea that exactly because of what we were mentioning, this kind of the fact that expert claims are losing ground, right? That everyone has the same kind of epistemic authority or whatever. This is why it's possible, you know, to kind of put political trust ahead of rational, you know, claim making. So rather that you say that, you know, I'm politically more aligned with the values of this side, and that hence, you know, I'm more likely to trust them. And also there has been this kind of weaponization of critical thinking, right? Because many of these conspiracy theorists claim that they realize something other people don't, claim that they deconstructed something. This is very important, that the whole idea of deconstruction, you know, was completely misused. And these people who claim, you know, want to feel that they are kind of doing this, some kind of very, I don't know, complex realization of something, are in fact receiving a completely pre-made narratives, I mean, they could, I'm not saying, but it's very hardly imaginable that they would all collectively arrive at an exactly same conclusion at the same time about some, so this is what I'm trying to say, that twisting of the idea of critical thinking and kind of the question of who do you trust politically, how disappointed you are in the political elites that represent some kind of expert-based claims. Yeah. Okay, I guess that, was that okay? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. All of you try to explain the populism from the top, from the to the bottom, and maybe through the politics in media, how will it affect on public opinion and also on the historiography. My question is, what about the politics from the bottom? We are witness of the small unknown publishers which all over product the memoirs or some kind of books which are related to the historiography and trying to maybe relativizate some part of the history. And my question is, what is your opinion, how will affect on the historiography maybe 50 years from now, when some younger student of history will try to go to the archives and it will have a lot of books and it will be very different to choose what is right, what is wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to go? Yeah? Tiasha? You.
Yeah, I just have, I agree with this. I think this is a real problem. For example, we have this kind of, we have the Study Center for National Reconciliation in Slovenia, and they kind of did, I don't know, they are not independent kind of publishers that you mentioned, but for example, they did this like a very noble kind of project, collecting the kind of stories of people, kind of enhancing this connection to the people, kind of telling them their stories, their pains, and so on. And this looks very convincing, This is like very approachable. It's like if you meet the topic for the first time, it's very, convincing. And I would also maybe go back to Reka. This is like, not every historian who works at this institution is a bad historian, like in general, They are like well-educated, they are parts of their work that is completely legit. But the problem here is the framework, because they, for example, say that their basic kind of idea is to bring together the three totalitarian regimes that Slovenes went through. So they kind of equate fascism, Nazism, and communism. So this is something that is also very common. So yes, I would say that this kind of populist production, if I may call it like that, I think it's effective, unfortunately, for better or for worse. So maybe if anybody else has comments about this, I would like to hear it.
Yes, I mean, I also think that such ventures to reach out to the everyman and try to understand their individual sort of experiences is very important, because this is exactly one way to reach a much broader audience. But really the responsibility lies with the researcher to properly contextualize it. Because the problem is that usually these are very much one-sided stories. Because if we would have, like stories of social mobility, not just downwards, but also upwards, or talking about people making it from the countryside and becoming like the first woman with a degree in a family. So if all those voices could have found their ways into such places, then it would be much better. But what we can do about this mass production, which cannot possibly be overseen, not professionally, not in any sense. I don't think we have an answer for that, because this is just part of the informational revolution in our tiny corner. And this is, and obviously books still remain like one of the most important medium, but if you put this together with the amount of information that is available in various different media, it's very, very easy to get lost. And yes, I don't think we have an overarching answer for this, but still this is a great and a very pressing question, and something that I also struggle with on a daily basis.
Great. Yeah, Vita, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just shortly. I think that the so-called mainstream academic community still functions as a very strong policeman. So, I mean, mostly what makes it also easy for us to create a line between like unprofessional practices and so approved of historiographical practices is where these kind of claims and narratives are published, right? So this doesn't mean that the international academic community will forever function as a gatekeeper. We have already seen in the context of the European Union this normalization of equating the so-called two totalitarianisms, right? So these gates have been opened, and we can now see more publications, explaining or historicizing the short 20th century along the lines of two coexisting not coexisting, but the two totalitarianisms. So we can see certain indents in the shiny structure of international historiographic academic community. So maybe, I mean, I don't know which other indents we can expect, but yeah, so far, the gatekeeper stands, for better and for worse.
Thank you very much. And let's go for the last question. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, just so we respect the time. Yeah.
I would like to add a comment, and thank you all for such an important discussion. Because I'm from media, I'm journalist, so I want to add to you, Vita, because it's pretty true that you said you have like really like 10 people who are all the time in the media in almost all of our country, depending on how huge it is. And that's why, because yeah, most of them are like pretty available, and you know, like many of them really don't want that kind of media attention. But I also have to add, it's up to us, and we are lazy or whatever, to you know, just get them out of the box and to have time to be patient, to, even though, you know, to somehow make you, like, I need to have time to really, like, give you my attention and really ask you if you would like to. So it's our obligation, and not many of us are doing that. So I just want to add that. So it's like on the both sides. It's just our obligation, and we are not doing that. So, yeah, it's a pity.
Thank you very much. Any response, Vita, or?
Yeah, thank you for sharing the journalistic side of the story. I would say that maybe sometimes our natural instinct as researchers is that we prefer to ask questions than to answer them. So maybe some kind of a different format where we would get to ask questions back to the journalist, because of course journalistic questions also have their own context, and sometimes when we receive a certain question, we kind of recognize the three layers behind this question. So maybe a different format that would soothe the anxious souls of timid historians.
That's a really good response. I completely agree. Okay, so I guess we can slowly wrap up. Thank you for your attention very much. Thank you for, I hope you're not too hungry. We have some, croissants, I guess, coffee. Please serve yourselves. And we continue at 11:45. And thank you everyone online who is watching. Yeah, that's it.
Welcome back, everyone, to the second panel of today's roundtable discussion on historians and populism. In our second roundtable, we will talk about more generally about what has changed in the conditions and demands for public history in populist contexts. We will tackle the questions about which historical narratives are utilized, called for, maybe marginalized, silenced, even censored, deplatformed or defunded in our region. We will tackle some concrete examples from the region, perhaps examples from the museums, school curricula, political programs, and also public historiographical debates. I am extremely happy to be able to welcome here the three panelists, the three speakers. They are a good mix of historical periods as well, because ranging from Lucia to Florian, they actually cover from the late 19th century until, well, our contemporary times. So we will go in this chronological direction when introducing them. Lucia Balikic is a doctoral student at the Department of History at the Central European University in Budapest. She is a graduate of University of Zagreb and CEU. She's currently working on two major projects. One of them is her doctoral thesis. She's doing research on the body politics in the interwar Yugoslavia through the prism of racial science, integral Yugoslavist intellectuals, and the Sokol gymnastics movement. But she is also contributing to the research project at the Democracy Institute in Budapest. The research project has the title Never Ending Story, Mapping Crisis Discourses in East Central Europe from 1918 until 2020. Our second speaker, Orsolya Sudar, is also a PhD candidate, so Lucia's colleague from CEU. They are both working at the Department of History there. And she's doing research on historical revisionism and architectural history in a comparative perspective. So she's looking at Budapest and Berlin. And her kind of historical research period is the long 20th century. Orsolya is also contributing or working with the Democracy Institute in Budapest, and she is also a leading member of the leftist political organization SZIKRA in Hungary. And our last speaker, Florian Bieber, a very versatile scholar who includes kind of expertise in history, but also more generally European integration, democracy, nationalism and ethnicity, minority rights, and so on. He's a professor of Southeast European History and Politics and director of the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz in Austria. Just to briefly mention two of his latest books, which kind of are very related to what we will talk about today. He published in 2020 a book with the title Debating Nationalism, the Global Spread of Nations. And in the same year, he also published a book with the title The Rise of Authoritarianism in the Western Balkans. And we will take it from here, actually, because Florian has been working on the topic of nationalisms in this region, in the, let's call it the Balkan region, for a long time. And you have this kind of, well, decades of experience, actually. So my question to you would be, do you see something radically or drastically new happening with the emergence of these so-called new populisms in the region? How would you think together nationalisms and new populisms?
Thanks. Yeah, when I was thinking about this, well, one of the starting points is that when I began working on the post-Yugoslav space in the 90s, there were many people who looked at the wars and the ethno-nationalism which underpinned it as, a specificity of the post-Yugoslav space, as kind of this is something which happens there, and it doesn't happen here, i.e. from a West European perspective. And this was never how I understood what was going on. I was trying to see it as a phenomena which can happen anywhere. And so in that sense, what happened in the 1990s, there are specific historical circumstances, crisis of a state, a crisis of an ideology, but the ethno-nationalism which came about in the context of the 1990s is, of course, not that fundamentally different than the ethno-nationalism or the populism we're talking about in global phenomena, as we discussed in the previous panel, as you pointed out. Now, of course, in every region and in every historical period, there are certain specificities, but it doesn't mean that it's a fundamentally different phenomenon. I think conceptually it's very helpful to actually consider it as one unit, which manifests itself differently in different periods of time, but which has many of the phenomena, the anti-elitism, the role of the other. We haven't talked about it that much in the previous panel, but I think populism and ethno-nationalism are based on the other as a fundamental constitutive idea, and the other might change, right? It might be George Soros, or it might be Jews, or it might be Roma, or it might be the neighboring nation, or it might be Muslims, but the function and the mechanism is very similar. So in that sense, I think studying what happened in the 1990s in Serbia, in Croatia, and in the other countries of former Yugoslavia helps me very much understand the mechanisms of how it operates globally in many ways today. So in that sense, I would not distinguish it. I mean, I think what is maybe a difference is that today there is more of an international of ethno-nationalists or populists. I mean, in the sense also that they borrow ideas, that they are inspiring and also legitimizing each other. And if you bring the phenomena of the 1990s into it, it's interesting how, in fact, a lot of the ethno-nationalists in Europe today seek legitimacy and borrow ideas from the ethno-nationalism of the 1990s in post-Yugoslavia, from far, white supremacist terrorists who've been explicitly praising Radovan Karadzic and war criminals, to the anti-Muslim discourse of mainstream European far-right parties, which borrow very explicitly from the rhetoric of the 1990s of the supposed Muslim threat. The whole idea of the anti-muralis Christianitatis, which we have in Croatia, or the defense of Europe as articulated in Serbian rhetoric or Bulgarian or elsewhere, the idea of this idea that there's the Ottoman threat now becomes a European threat in a more legitimate way. And I think this is interesting how these ideas, which of course weren't created in the 1980s and 90s in Yugoslavia, but which were popularized, were then kind of absorbed into the larger European ethno-nationalist debates and are now going back into the region in many ways. So the Great Replacement theory, these ideas are coming back in Southeastern Europe, and they provide some kind of legitimacy for the projects of the 1990s. So in that sense, I think there's a flow, a communication flow of these ideas, which again shows you how that they are, the kind of the seeming contradiction between the universalist nature of these ethno-national claims, which are on one side very particular, but then also they're becoming more internationalized. And so I would even say that there is a European civilizationism. I mean, this is what Rogers Brubaker's talked about, this idea that actually there is this kind of category which is more than just ethno-nationalism. There's a civilizational claim which is being made by many of those groups, which provides them for a greater sense of legitimacy, avoids certain accusations of being ethno-national, because they can say, well, I'm not defending the Germans or a particular ethno-national community, but rather Europeans. So it's a very useful mechanism of legitimacy, but I think it also shows a shift from more kind of fragmented ethno-national movements to ones which are able to, in a certain way, jointly act under the umbrella of supposed European civilization. What that means, again, varies across the continent, but I think that is maybe the biggest change, I would say, when you compare the period of the 90s, where these were more fragmented ideas to ones which become more interlinked today, which, you could say is arguably much more troubling.
Would you say that scholars who are right now trying to understand the emergent nationalisms in other European regions, and the general impression one gets is that so many people are so surprised about it, like in France or in the UK, like the general idea is, or the general feeling is, how can this happen to us as well? Would you say that the scholars who are seriously thinking about these issues are looking at already existent scholarship on nationalisms in the Balkans and learning something from it, or is there like a miscommunication or non-communication going on?
I think there's still a bit of a divide. Scholars who work on France or Germany would rarely consult scholars work on the post-Yugoslav space. It's of course partly, you could say, a phenomena which is the result of the high fragmentation of both historiography as well as, let's say, political science. I've always felt that, for example, in political science, scholars of post-communist Europe, let's say, always excluded Yugoslavia because it didn't fit into the larger analytical framework. So even there, where you can say it's, if you look at European studies or European history, it's often the history of large important, quote-unquote, European countries, which neglects others, like especially the ones which don't fit into the seemingly larger trends. So I think there is a blind spot. And then, of course, there are also these biases in the sense that partly the region which I'm studying is seen as insignificant, and rather not working in the cyclical phases of the rest of Europe, seemingly. So you can kind of disregard it, or it doesn't fit into the mental maps which people have. And there is still, there's still a very important, I think, mental map which ignores Europe's east and southeast. Just to give you, an illustration, not academically, but how many debates have we seen in recent months since the war in Ukraine began, where media talked about the war has returned to Europe, right? Yeah. Which, for scholars of Yugoslavia and the wars of the 90s, it makes you just feel very bitter because, I was counting, since the end of the Cold War, there were more years of war in Europe than there were years of peace. If you count the Yugoslav wars, if you count the Chechen war, if you count the Ukrainian war since 2014, the wars in the Caucasus, in Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia, there's been more years of war than peace in Europe since 1989. It's a very Western-centric view to see that war is something which was not part of Europe since 1945 until a month ago. But I think this is not just an accident, but I think it's that our memory of the wars of the 90s is not yet a European memory in the fullest sense of acknowledging this as part of our memory. It's still their memory. It's still it's somewhere there. It's like this Balkanism of Maria Todorova. It's not exactly not Europe, but it's not exactly Europe, and so this makes it easier to ignore this and to kind of exoticize it rather than acknowledge that, when Eric Zemmour speaks in France as a presidential candidate, he's not that different from, Vojislav Šešelj. Maybe the physique is different, but otherwise, the repertoire and the resentment they play off are similar, and we should maybe really create these dialogues, which I think are still missing.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that this is maybe why so many politicians from the Balkan region are now very quick to draw these easy and actually historically incorrect parallels with Ukraine and the Balkan wars? That this is one way of trying to, somehow desperately insert the region into the European narrative or debate?
It's certainly a way to legitimize also your own interpretations. I think the examples from Slovenia are great ways in which to kind of make these claims and give an importance to the war in 1991. But also we've seen other very different reflexes in Serbia, for example, where the argument very frequently has been that that the parallel is drawn to the NATO bombing in 1999. So the parallel is not drawn So it also shows the blind spots. The parallels, you know, it just show as much the connections as what one doesn't want to say. So I haven't seen many people in Serbia saying, I mean, of course, for very critical intellectuals who of course exist, who compared with Vukovar or with Sarajevo, but they say, no, but we were bombed as well by NATO, so how can we even condemn Russian aggression against Ukraine if NATO isn't, you know, owning up to its own bombing of Serbia? So, you know, you can see how the war is then, you know, basically serving to re-legitimize existing national narratives, be it in Slovenia, be it in Serbia, for very different narratives, and of course to try to give them legitimacy in the larger European debates.
Taking this kind of what Florian has said about nationalisms in the region, I believe we kind of are, we were all exposed to a similar concept while being educated as future historians, and that was the concept of revisionism, historical revisionism. This was the main conceptual tool that historians so far have had when dealing with these kind of nationalist interpretations of history and so on. And Orsoya is kind of an expert on historical revisionism in the region, so would you kind of help us understand how this concept functions now, how it functioned before? Does something change with the new populisms in the region, in how this concept is useful or maybe not for historians?
Yes, I think what's interesting and drawing on the conclusions from the previous panel is that we talk a lot about populism and left-wing populism, right-wing populism, but what I think has a lot to do with how we operate in this profession of history is how we approach the fact that we are producing content in, as we said, in a neoliberal market economy where work is also being commodified. And revisionism has a specific place in this because it produces content. It's also content production in the most abusive way of history. And it's hard, as we discussed in the previous panel, sometimes it's hard to differentiate between the good kind of revisionism and the bad kind of revisionism, the good kind of populism, the bad kind of populism. So I think what's hard as historians is to define the thin line between, you know, revising history and opening new questions about known or previously discussed topics and being revisionist. And for me, methodologically, and I think it's always a question of methodology, and that's what the discussion should always be about in terms of methodology. It's really hard to point out the methodological devices in the hands of Fidesz propagandist historians, for instance, because they don't really have a methodology. What they have and what we can distinguish is different practices that they operate with. And one of them is a linguistic praxis that they don't, so for instance, we have an elephant in the room, Maria Schmidt, who's one of the most known propagandists in Orban's history regime. And she's producing a lot of content. Reka usually calls her former historian, but she's also a very present historian in our world as the leader. Many of you know the House of Terror. She's the head of this installation complex. So what her approach is usually is a very linguistic one. So she usually uses historical facts. So it's not complete fiction, and that has to do with the last question from the previous panel: how we distinguish between conspiracy and actual research. How do we distinguish between reality and fiction? And she blurs the two very intentionally by not defining her subject. So she uses the passive voice a lot, even in Hungarian, which is a little unlinguistic or not a traditional. She uses a lot of adverbials. She confuses different kinds of concepts, and that brings me to my next topic, that revisionism is oftentimes, or it operates with conceptual blurs. saying that Bolshevism is or equals big state, or propaganda equals communism. And of course, these concepts most of the time serve the single political purpose of presenting the current government as anti-communist, as anti-big state, as which is again a conceptual problem. And another aspect that we know, and this is the most common aspect of revisionism, is anachronism, and the temporal blur between different things, and which leads, of course, to essentialism and the oversimplification of history. And in regards with populism, in a little defense of populism is, I know we discussed the left wing and the right wing populism, but I think what we discussed with the moment of populism is the fact that there is a disillusionment with the neoliberal status quo. And there is a disillusionment among historians and among academics as well with being content producers as such. And what I think is always difficult is to pinpoint that moment when you're not producing content in the similar way as you're criticizing anymore. Because what Fidesz and I think Janscha's strategy is also is to commodify history, make it into a spectacle, pretend that it's something that you can consume, that it's something that brings with the rest of the neoliberal, commodified, content-oriented world, and make it into something that's not a process, because everything that we do is part of a longer historical process. So if we look at our own conclusions, we look at them, 20 years from now, we will see very different connections. So what the current situation is that history for politicians in the neoliberal system becomes a product, it becomes a commodity that you can consume on the way. And in terms of architecture, I'm looking at how the commodification of history is manifested in space, specifically.
Could you maybe say a few sentences about your findings on so the two case studies that you are working on in your PhD?
Yeah, unfortunately, because of COVID, I couldn't really do my Berlin research, so I'm not going to hypothesize on that so much, but I'm researching the Buda Castle in Budapest, which is under reconstruction in a government-led project called the Haussmann Project. And what we can see is that they're reconstructing buildings that were damaged in the Second World War during the bombings. And also, so they're reconstructing them from the ground. So they weren't there for 40 years, and now they're building them up and renovating other buildings that do not look enough like they did in the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the recurring themes of justifying why we need this immense, it's a very expensive project, is one of the reasons why we need this, according to the government, is that the communist era ribbed some kind of, so they took away all the historical heritage of Hungary as a nation, and they took away our national pride in terms of the royal spaces of Hungary, and now they're giving it back. And that's the initial narrative. And I'm trying to understand what kind of revisionist tendencies take place within those reconstructions, and what kind of narratives of national belonging and nationhood are reconstructed that were constructed in the beginning of the 20th century in consolidation of the monarchy at that time.
So you are in some way observing the actual materialized rewriting of history. Well, to explore further some concrete examples from the region, Lucia here has a kind of shared or a diverse experience of both the ex-Yugoslav region, so Croatia, especially the Croatian part, and this hardcore post-communist region, Hungary. And I know that you're a treasure box of different examples of how this kind of historical revisionism works. So just go ahead and indulge us with a few of your thoughts on how public history functions in this region.
Thanks. A good introduction. Now I feel a bit of pressure, but so just to be say some, maybe first of all, some kind of context for this. I mean, is that obviously, as Vita said initially, I live in Budapest for some time, and I just became quite interested living there in what is going on, coming from the Yugo region, coming from being kind of very, very deeply interested in the breakup of Yugoslavia, but also making of Yugoslavia, so kind of all the different versions of Yugoslavism in different eras and so on. I was also really interested to see, what are the similarities and differences of different, in terms of Hungarian nationalism, but also this was a really turbulent time, and I kind of really experienced it also emotionally when I was living there, kind of everything that was going on in terms of public history, because there were some very important anniversaries going on, a lot of rewriting of history, and this is kind of the context why I was also professionally interested, not just privately to kind of, see what's going on in the city, but really professionally to, sit down, engage with historiography, learn a bit of Hungarian, go a bit into comparisons on a more deeper level, especially what Florian was mentioning before, this kind of how certain populist or nationalist ideas exit the Yugo region, get fertilized in the European space and come back. So for me also Hungary was kind of an interesting example of that. Also in terms of differences, right? Because there are some very key differences between these cases. So what I would like to maybe say now is rather a comparison between these two, in the sense that, for example, in the Yugo case, we see a lot of, as Florian mentioned, this rewriting of Yugoslav history, naturally or unfortunately from the inside, of course, because of the breakup of Yugoslavia, but also from the outside, so which is oftentimes something that doesn't fit into the EU-promoted, remembrance, EU-promoted memory politics in the sense of, not just equating to totalitarianisms, which has been something of a, dominant paradigm in this period, but also just generally. So this whole experience of such a country, many of things that were the founding facts in the sense that it had, for example, a domestic massive partisan movement. It was not liberated by the Soviets in that, obviously, quote unquote, or more or less, right? So, I mean, these are things that just don't fit and which have unfortunately been countered from inside and outside. So what I'm trying to say is that in, for example, Croatian historiography, we see since the 90s, of course, a very strong current of distancing Croatian national history from the project of Yugoslavism and state socialism. So these two main sort of enemies. And this means that Croatian nationalism is, from the early 19th century or even earlier onwards presented as, naturalized, decontextualized, even dehistoricized, shown as something which was not in dialogue with South Slavic national integration principles or ideas or processes, something that was not in dialogue with other like Serbian nationalism, for example. Also, the state socialist project was in a certain way, imported. I mean, it's hard to claim that. Of course, in Hungary, it's much easier to claim it, that it was Muscovites or something. But in the Yugo case, it's very, especially in Croatia, when you think about the partisan movement, it takes a lot of rewriting of history, let's put it like that. So this is something that in especially Croatian example is, of course, I'm not saying that it's a hegemonic discourse, but it's very much promoted in the state institutions, even by the state media, about this very, kind of deep production about the homeland war and with this whole new vocabulary about what happened in the 90s, where we have these homeland defenders, this kind of not bringing into question the other part, like for not acknowledging that, for example, it was a civil war at the beginning and war for independence was a kind of later occurrence, or not later, but it was kind of not something that was teleologically, realizing itself in the last 1,000 generations. So this is on the one hand. And on the other hand, in Hungary, we have something quite similar in the sense that there is no national agency in historiography or in public space when we talk about any kind of communist or say socialist project. There is not much national agency, or it's being removed in this populist context. So for example, one good example that I would like to maybe mention is for those of you who have been in Budapest, on the Kossuth Square, so where the parliament is, there used to be, until quite recently, a statue of a man standing on like a bridge, which was Imre Nagy, so the leader of the 1956 revolution, which was relatively recently removed, I think 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, and which stood there from 1996, so it was part of this kind of anniversary after the, in the context of democratic transition and so on, which was, in my opinion, and we can discuss this, of course, with Reka and Orsi, but I think that one of the reasons why it was removed is exactly this current of kind of removing the national agency from any kind of communist project or state socialist project, even in the context, obviously, of 56, which is such a very, very important kind of crucial event from this period. And instead of it on the same place, so facing the parliament, which is part of a larger project of redesigning the Kossuth Square, which is one of the most important squares, was a new monument was erected to the victims of Red Terror, which actually is exactly the same monument. I mean, design is exactly the same as the one that was put there in 1934 under the regime of Admiral Miklos Horthy, who we, I think, know was definitely, a problematic figure, and which was supposed to commemorate victims of the Hungarian Soviet Republic and so on, to kind of showcase this, victory of White Army, but rather to commemorate these victims, and it was put there in a attempt to kind of obviously not just alienate this left heritage, but it's very important in the Hungarian example that this left or communist or socialist heritage is oftentimes very artificially lumped with liberal heritage. So this is one of those key words in the Orban discourse that you say, left liberals did this or did that, or are historically responsible for example, Trianon Peace Treaty, or these big cultural and national traumas of which, the consequences are very heavy for the whole nation and for the state. So this changing of this kind of national communist figure to this kind of remembering of the victims, and this monument, just to describe it how it looks, so it's kind of modernist, a monument where we see this anthropomorphized Hungaria in this kind of very national romanticist, kind of armor and so on, and it has the same inscription that it had in 1934 and so on. So this was for me one of those, there are many such projects in Budapest, we don't have time for all, but this was for me one of those symbols of kind of changing this paradigm, alienating left and liberal heritage and saying that there is no national agency there. Nation appears in other historical moments, and nation carries different kind of values, and that's very important. Maybe another one that I would mention in Croatia, I don't know if it's the best comparison, we can also discuss that, is the relatively recent, 5 years ago, removing of the Marshal Tito Square name in the center of Zagreb, where the Croatian National Theatre is located, which was kind of initiative by historians. This is the reason why I'm mentioning it. One is, of course, Zlatko Hasanbegovic, who is very controversial Minister of Culture in Tomislav Karamarko's right-wing government, and the other one is Bruna Esih, who is more concentrated on victims of Croatian victims of communist terror, and it was their initiative basically because they were in the city council and so on to kind of rename it into the Republic of Croatia Square. Yeah, and this was done with, of course, big controversies in the public space and big questioning of, Tito was a Croat, but to which extent? What is he responsible for? What should the heritage of Titoism be in the post-Yugoslav region generally and in Croatia especially? And then at the same time, there was another initiative which was never realized but was quite talked about at the time by the same historians, to change the name of the Masaryk street, which is right next to the square, because Tomasz Masaryk supported the Yugoslav project, right? He supported integral Yugoslavism, which, I mean, is not untrue, but it is not something to, how to say, remove this street name for, in the sense that if obviously we are trying to, I mean, Tomasz Garik Masaryk did more for Croatian statehood than many of those people that Hasanbegović and Esih celebrate in the First World War and later. So this was stopped because of many, public intellectuals came out and so on. So it was kind of a big debate. Should Masaryk be removed for this reason? I mean, this street was, by the way, introduced in 1930, so it was quite a long name of the street. I mean, it existed for a long time. So this is also one of those really paradoxical populist attempts to kind of remove the idea of Croatian nationhood from any kind of Yugoslavist framework, and especially from the idea that the Yugoslav state project contributed to Croatian statehood. So this is one of those key, ideas that is independent Croatian statehood kind of result of this, Jajce agreement, this federal republic, or is it rather something that is a completely different project with completely different values, not something that we should say partisans are responsible for? So this would be maybe some of my examples, and maybe the last example, just to tie it back to the EU question and to the generally European kind of paradigm, and to connect it to Hungary back again, it would be to say that the best example maybe of wrong reading of Yugoslav history, or kind of perhaps not populist, but definitely misunderstanding, is the Courage project, which was hosted by Hungarian Academy of Sciences, by people who kind of wanted to digitize and make more accessible and collect the historical sources related to cultural opposition figures and groups during state socialism in Central European countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on, using this, kind of typical paradigm that people who were in cultural opposition were liberals, or they wanted to democratize the society, and they had their cultural kind of dissident world in which, they published some kind of samizdats or whatever. And what they did not realize, I mean, is when Croatia was included in this project as one of the, or Croatian Institute for History, was actually that they had an intention of digitizing or collecting a different kind of sources, which were not just cultural opposition, people who were some kind of liberals, but actually people who were really extremely right-wing, rehabilitating certain ideas from the Second World War and so on, who lived in emigration or, opposing Yugoslavia from transatlantic spaces, and and this was not problematized, basically, I would even say maybe not within the project, until Dubravka Ugrašić published in the New York Review of Books her kind of very strong reaction on the exhibition called Archaeology of Resistance. So this is one of those interesting examples where kind of EU funds rehabilitation of extreme right-wing World War II, sources and thinkers and ideas, ideologies, by assuming that Yugoslavia fits into this paradigm, or maybe not caring. Yeah, one of those two. So I hope this answers your question.
Thank you, Lucia. And it's also a good example of a successful intervention, right? As you said, that it took a scholar from the region to kind of point to the problematic aspects of the project. And since Lucia already introduced us to this, to the topic of EU frameworks of doing history, I would now turn back to Florian. How would you say that the not just European but EU context influences the way public history is done in the region, both in positive and negative ways? So which things get lost in translation, which things get glossed over? Does maybe EU enable certain problematic practices, police certain practices?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the points which I think are important have been made. I mean, the whole narrative of the two totalitarianisms, which, of course, is, I think, one of the central kind of introductions into the European remembrance framework, coming mostly from Central Europe, which has become widely accepted, I would say, not, of course, by historians. There's lots of criticism, but I think in the public discourse it's quite acceptable. And, of course, I mean, it's simplistic, especially in the post-Yugoslav space, but it's also simplistic, of course, beyond that, because it is not a simple dualism. And I think so of course, some of the elements have to do with the fact that let's say, the European memory debates and history writing has this Western-centric legacy, which we've talked about before, and which then means also that one maybe easily accepts nationalist narratives coming from elsewhere as legitimate because one doesn't know, or one can't distinguish what is revisionist in a negative way and what is critical historiography. There are a couple of, I think, also blind spots in the way in which Europe, or it's always hard to say what are we talking about. Is it public? Let's say the way publicly is talked about history of Europe, and especially European integration and the European Union, is of course the EU itself does not have a policy on the past. I mean, there are declarations. We know these declarations in the European Parliament, which colleagues like Anna Milosevic and Tamara Pavasovic-Tros have written about and studied, or the kind of memory framework which Jelena Subotic has written nicely about, and how both Croatia, Serbia, and Lithuania, I think she's looked at, try to fit into these frameworks, but also shape them as a result. So I think there's this attempt to fit into the framework out of some sense of ontological insecurity in countries, but it's also a way to shape them, of course, which is the result of that. The blind spots which are a part of that is of course a very teleological view of European history, of the defeat in World War II, and then the kind of rising from the phoenix, rising from the ashes in an enlightened Europe of integration. And I think that allows for actually this kind of narratives, these problematic narratives to kind of fit into that, because then that means the narrative of like, well, then there was the land of communism, and then they threw off communism and then joined the rest of Europe in a free society. And this might be nice from a Sunday speech perspective, but it's so fundamentally distorting historical reality, and it creates all these topics one ignores. I mean, and so one of the topics which I found is of course recently by historians brought up more, but I think in the public debate not yet fully acknowledged, is the colonial. I mean, of course, we talk about the colonial legacy of Europe, and that's not forgotten, but that the colonial legacy existed and coexisted with European integration, right? I mean, the early European community was a European community with Algeria part of it. Algeria was an integral part of the European community, so to speak. And war, I mean, we're talking about war again, but war was waged on the territory of the European community in the case of the French war against the Algerian independence movement. And this kind of mental map that there's this African history of Europe after World War II. So when Europe was supposed to be this enlightened force which brings together countries which want to overcome war and the legacies of extreme nationalism, well, this was also the Europe where in Paris, hundreds of Algerians were shot by the police in 1961, I believe, and were thrown into the River Seine. I mean, this is there's this blind spot in European self-narrative, and which creates this kind of very idealized version of the way democracy and states operated after World War II, and which also then fits into this whole narrative of the return to Europe, this very important narrative in Central Europe, which again allows for, first of all, which allows for very ethno-nationalist views actually to fit into the European narrative, because this return to Europe is that, we threw away the Soviet rule, and as a result, returned to Europe. So, and unchallenging like all of the ethno-nationalism which operates under this label. And if we look at the Croatia, I mean, both the Croatia and the Baltics are illustrations of that this return to Europe argument or Slovenia with the erased. I mean, there are all these layers of exclusions which happen in this moment, which you can brush off with the label of Europe. So I think this is for me a big problem of these narratives, which really allow for very exclusionary views to fit into this and uncritically fit into it. And it basically reveals the way in which we have to really look at the narratives of European integration, Europeanism much more critically, and and accept that that this idea of this enlightened Europe coming out of World War II is a very self-serving and very problematic view. I mean, not to mention the idea that this idea of Europe excludes Muslims. I mean, the history of Islam in Europe. I mean, the fact that many European statesmen and officials cannot get over the fact to acknowledge that Islam is a European religion, just like Judaism and Christianity are, is for me very indicative, because the history of Islam is written out of the history of Europe. And so we have this and within it, I mean, and this is, I think, maybe the other element to the last point, is that it's a history of nation states, right? It's an assumption that nation states are the natural unit which European integration is built on. And what is, I think, ignored from that is that, I mean, and this is the kind of paradox, that I think like one of the founding paradoxes of the European integration, that Europe was never as homogeneous as it was when European integration began, in terms of ethnic cleansing, in terms of the Holocaust, in terms of the millions of refugees during and after the Second World War. And it was on that nation-state logic which the European integration project emerged. And I'm not saying that this disqualifies or discredits European integration, but we have to acknowledge that, in fact, Europe was never as homogeneous in terms of and kind of created in these nation-states unit as it was when European integration began. So it kind of normalizes that, rather than acknowledging that actually European history is actually overall much more diverse and much more interlinked and much less ethnic, kind of creating these ethnic silos than what has become the normal assumed order of the European integration and its assuming units. And I think this kind of reflection I don't see enough yet, and I think that re-legitimizes in the end ethno-nationalist and kind of nation-state-centric perspectives.
To return back from the European framework to our region, let's say, Lucia, you've been mentioning in our previous conversations the function of this idea in contemporary populisms in the region, the function of this idea of imperial nostalgia, of there used to be this great past that was, usually the narrative is, it was interrupted by communism, but there's also some variations on this. So this, we used to be great re-narration of national pasts. Would you maybe explain a bit further in the Hungarian context, because I think that example is most pronounced in the region?
Yeah, so this is something that really, got me thinking, there about this kind of course we can see it on a global scale. I mean, we can talk about, imperial revival behind the Brexit, kind of these kind of ideas. I think many people tackled that in different conversations or behind some other processes. But for me, it was, I really started thinking about it in Hungary as I witnessed the 100th anniversary of the Trianon Peace Treaty, which was supposed to take place in 2020. And there were many plans underway, which were, of course, cancelled. They were supposed to take place in June. As we all know, that was also not really time for big public events. But in leading up to this centenary, there were a lot of preparations and a lot of, ink was spilled over this. And there were so many things in public history, in popular history, that were kind of referring to this. And this really, really showed me how populism can very much prosper in discourses on, the glorious imperial past, or generally just about how imperial structures work, or imagined imperial histories, and so on. And in this context, for me, it was so obvious how this commemoration of this peace treaty of Trianon, so which was signed in 1920, right after Austria-Hungary fell apart, and hence the Kingdom of Hungary as well, whereby many territories actually became parts of the surrounding states around Hungary, right? Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, and so on. And which was always, since then, basically, so in the 1920s and onwards, kind of constructed as this big national trauma, and which was at first trying to be countered through different kinds of expert claims, like maps and statistics and so on, then through different kind of cultural projects, then through different kinds of cooperation with this very numerous Hungarian minority around, and so on. So there were obviously different strategies, but in this context, in this populist context, it was striking for me that this story legitimizes so many different policies and strategies that are in fact, result of this populist regime of national cooperation, as it is called in Hungary. So, for example, I would say that this blaming the liberal and left, which is again very artificially lumped together category, and also Western actors for this very important national trauma, helps actually to historically legitimize the contemporary anti-liberal, anti-left, anti-Western orientation of Hungary, to say that they wronged us once, they caused all this mess, and now they're, doing it again, posing Brussels as some kind of, Paris of 1919 or something like that. I really see parallels in that. We can, of course, again, discuss it, but I think it's not accidental that all these commemorations and all these discourses were happening at the same time as the Stop Brussels campaign. Then again, of course, what is a really important factor is that in this vision of this Kingdom of Hungary, actually it is presented as a kind of relatively homogeneous unit in the sense that it's a natural ethnic Hungarian space. So of course there are other categories, not just historical Hungary. You can also say Carpathian Basin, which is one of those, geographical terms that was kind of invented exactly in this context, right, in the 1920s, to justify that there is a geographical logic behind this country and this was not uncommon. I mean, Yugoslavia was also made upon, arguments of Jovan Cvic and such geographers, so this is the time when geography is increasingly, playing with political claims of different countries, but still this idea of Carpathian Basin and geography legitimizing political claims persisted until this very day as a very dominant category. So in this context, not only geography, but also the ethnic, kind of population of this, although obviously, I mean, it was around or a bit less than 50% of the population in Kingdom of Hungary were speakers of Hungarian language, which is also very tricky to check, right, because of the so-called Magyarization policies and the mandatory, speaking of Hungarian in different contexts. So, but more or less what we can say is that it was a country with many languages and cultures and which cannot easily be presented as a very homogeneous ethnic space, but in populist, very brutal, simplifications of this story, it is basically presented as kind of symbolizing the Magyar ethnic kind of space. And in this context, of course, you can easily claim that these lands were taken away from us because they were ours, right? So it was not anybody, there were no other participants. I mean, yeah. So furthermore, this, in my opinion, legitimizes one of the very, very, very important Fidesz policies, which I found, and that's my motivation for learning Hungarian language, really, because I have a feeling that that's how you get into different countries of Central Europe, if you, can see it from that perspective, is actually that there is this process for around, 2010, from around 2010, that basically they were, homogenizing minority communities outside of Hungary in a political way, so that the parties that represent them or cultural associations that they have basically became strictly tied to Fidesz, right? So you cannot really participate in cultural, political, or, any kind of organized behavior as a Hungarian minority in other countries without kind of being subjected to this very, centralized, line of command, I would even say, because it's really all other parties or other political affiliations or opinions were kind of eliminated. So we can see this in many cases. And the story about Trianon really legitimizes this because it says that your your homeland, right, will take care of you financially. We will invest in your infrastructure. We will give you opportunities to achieve social mobility, So these are big promises that you can really count on, especially for the non-EU member, like Serbia and Ukraine and so on. So this is very important. And together with this, there was also this new citizenship scheme that was introduced, in which it was very, very, very easy to get Hungarian citizenship based on having ancestors from the Carpathian Basin, which many non-Hungarian speakers have, and just learning B1 level of Hungarian, which is not that hard. So, in general, you can very easily get citizenship and perhaps move to, Germany, if you are from Serbia, for example. I also have acquaintances who did this, so they just took a one-year course, got, Hungarian citizenship, and now they live somewhere in the EU. And this, of course, boosts the number also of these people. So this is kind of a related thing. Together with that, so, all these strategies kind of really, really are legitimized by the Trianon trauma, and it's kind of a way of rehabilitating, or, way of kind of getting back for that and trying to take care of the co-patriots on the other side of the border. But there are other things that are going on in parallel with that as well, which for me have historical significance, because, for example, in certain cities like in Romania, Slovakia, Croatia, actually companies very close to the Hungarian government are buying property, but not just any property, but like really representative historical buildings in the city center. This was recently raised by investigative journalists from Slovakia, for example, on the basis of the city of Košice, where they bought, again, urban palaces, with beautiful architecture, which will then be made into, Hungarian cultural center or something like that. Then, of course, even in my home city of Osijek, a very beautiful, architecturally unique building, which is part of cultural heritage, will now be the General Consulate of Hungary, and so on. In other cities, it will be like a cultural institute, and so on. So we can discuss to which extent this is connected, but in my opinion, the fact that the company, which is very tied to the government, is buying these very important buildings in the very city centers is a kind of a power move in which they can claim to their constituencies that we are reasserting ourselves. We are reasserting our dominance in the Carpathian Basin. We are protecting our, compatriots on the other side of the border, and so on. For example, it is also interesting the name of the associations that cares, because this is also sometimes framed as taking care of Hungarian tangible cultural heritage across the border. So there is this foundation for preserving immobile heritage of Central Europe, which is, of course, a Hungarian association which manages these properties. So it's also kind of something you can easily also sell in the West, if you, for different kinds of stories. So, yeah, and what is unfortunate reaction, actually, what I heard, because from different countries where I, kind of spoke to people about this, like, aren't you concerned at least a bit, what does this mean? I'm not saying they should not have it, but it's having in mind that Fidesz is doing it is, of course, problematic, is that many people are saying, especially in Croatia, and I spoke in multiple parts of Croatia, also at the seaside and in the countries, in the mainland, everybody is saying that, but at least somebody's investing in it. At least we would not invest it. Our state would never renovate these buildings. They were deteriorating, falling apart, or this part of the city was neglected. At least finally, somebody is investing in it. And this logic that we kind of let ourselves be, invested in by such actors, because who else would do it, or because, our politicians are corrupt anyway, they are neglecting our heritage anyway, is also, of course, I would say, a dangerous idea, which really legitimizes both this, kind of populist project, and also this, I would say, very lucrative also financial business of Fidesz, but on the other hand, also this kind of being indifferent towards this Trianon narrative, which is directly connected to this economic and political penetration into the post-Yugo region, for example, but also, as I said, other surrounding countries.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add something?
Yes, sure. Yeah, of course.
I think it's really interesting what you're saying, and what I find to be the connecting trope in all this is the question of national agency, as you pointed out in the beginning. And one interesting aspect of the question of national agency, that it really serves as a tool, because I think, and this is just my hypothesis, that Fidesz and Orbán are not doing this out of a purely ideological, I don't know, desire to actually, not because they believe in Hungarian imperial, legacies, but it's a purely political economic thing that they want to reserve as many resources in the region as possible, and it's less or more of a thin ideology than it is political and economic. But the question of national agency is a tool in the hands of revisionist history to prove certain historical continuities and disapprove of other ones. So I think one of the good examples among the ones that you listed is the example of the National Gallery that is found in the Castle district or within the Royal Palace of Buda. And it was originally created after '56 because the Kádár government understood that there is a need for national narratives to exist within socialism, and the national identity has to be created and it has to be given room for. And the National Gallery started its operation at Kossuth Square, and the building of the Curia, and then it was moved to the castle later on. And now they're saying that the National Gallery lacks legitimacy because it was created by the communist government. So, and in this sense, they're not delegitimizing the purpose of the National Gallery to have a National Gallery, but that, as you said, the entire historical perspective is that there couldn't be a national agency in the socialist period. And that's the main argument, that the socialist period lacks national agency, it lacks national character, it lacks any kind of national interest, it only serves the purpose of the Soviet Union. And I think this is something that we will have to deal with for a really long time when it comes to symbolic geographies and trying to reimagine the national character. And as historians, it will become problematic for a really long time how these national character issues that are real and that are, material in their own sense turn into, again, this identity politics issue that is, again, a commodified way of turning history into a question of identity and not a question of inquiry and whether seeking out actual agencies in the meantime. So, yeah.
I agree. One sentence, just a response, is I agree, and it's a really, really good point that you raise, but just to kind of draw the line, what I was arguing is just that the more you construct this Trianon trauma, and you construct it with, pouring a lot of money into exhibitions, events, Maria Schmidt's projects, exhibitions, things like that, the more legitimate it is to take back what was taken from you. Yeah, yeah. And this is what I want to say. So this is a story to kind of cover up for the economic and financial investment in the, dismembered Yugo region. Yeah.
And the final question for Orsolya. Today we have been mostly actually, or just mentioning examples of right-wing misappropriations of history. But there are arguments to be made and are made by scholars such as Chantal Mouffe, right? That there is, electoral future or a political future in supporting left populisms. And since you are also politically active, I wanted to ask you, what's your take on left populism in this region? Because in the post-communist region, my impression is that left populism is totally decapitated. It has a much tougher time kind of establishing itself. So what's your take on how left populism functions in this region?
Well, I think it's a hard question because it's it's been proclaimed dead. So the moment of left populism has passed because the tides have changed since 2018 and since the entire discussion on populism has been hijacked by the rise of right-wing populism. But I think it's just important to always keep in mind that the good part of creating a narrative of the elite versus the people is exactly to highlight the issues with the status quo. And that's not something that's done usually outside of the narratives of populism as a pejorative term. And while I definitely agree that like all kinds of populism are detrimental to the historical profession because they create false narratives exactly because of these conceptual issues that they merge and essentialize, and because of this like homogenizing tendency of populism. But at the same time, because we started this panel kind of identifying the issue of the crisis of expertise and the crisis of professionalism, this is something that is created by the elite, and it is something that is maintained by the elite. So I think it's always important to touch upon that. And in the region, I guess it's especially important, not just as historians who will move to Western countries and be faced with very, very different prospects than local people in Western or at Western institutions, but also as professionals who actually have a say in how we form our narrative of national history. So yes, that's basically it. But if you guys also have...
Okay, thank you. So we have time for questions. We turn to the audience now. If not, I will ask, that final question that we asked in the previous panel as well. What are our mechanisms of resistance? As scholars, as historians, what are possible ways forward, in your opinion? And you can take turns, whoever wants to go first.
Maybe we can start towards you. I would briefly say, history education. So for me, of course there are many ways, but for me the most important would be education in the subject of history, which is not accidental, that is getting harder and harder and less profitable to do a history degree or to kind of that, we are getting more and more precarious, work and so on. But generally, I think that so knowing how history operates or knowing how to understand historical narratives, how to deconstruct or how they come about, so how they are realized. This is something that builds resilience in thinkers. That's it. This is what I would say. And these people who are trained in this, who can recognize, who operate with concepts such as historical revisionism or everything that we mentioned today, those people are resilient to bad histories, to bad historical narratives, to populist mechanisms of, as Orsi was saying, of blurring the lines and so on. So people who are conceptually sensitive and who, again, realize that it's a selective thing, there's no such thing as positive knowledge, so these kind of basic things that, by the way, we are not always taught in school, at least in this region. This is something that would be the most peaceful way of resistance.
Yeah, I can just reiterate what you were saying, but I agree with the approach that theoretical engagement, as you said, is one of the most crucial aspects. And I don't know if the media representation of historians would democratize the profession as much as needed, but definitely a strong yeah, a strong tendency to democratize the profession would, from within and not from above, would definitely help.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, I mean, I would agree with all of those observations, of course. I mean, one of the points which, of course, was mentioned in the previous panel is the public engagement. I think this is what I think academics have to be public, facing the public. I mean, this is fundamental, and there are many ways which we can do it. And the problem, of course, institutionally, it's usually not rewarded. There's no incentive to do it, and we all, if we do it, face a lot of difficulties in different ways. I mean, you know, of course, I can say I'm speaking from a privileged position of having an academic post, which is permanent and in an environment where I can be critical. And I know that many others hesitate for reasons which I fully support and understand. So it's a personal choice of the freedoms you have and you don't have. But I think even more so for those who have the freedom to speak up and to be critical without risking anything beyond you know, slander or whatever, should do it, because it's about public engagement, it's about speaking up, it's about, but it's not just about, I mean, I think the previous panel, the point was about, you know, talking to journalists, which of course I would fully agree, and I do very actively, because I say, how can I criticize media reporting if I don't speak to journalists? I mean, if I don't provide information, then I cannot be critical of the lack of historical knowledge or whatever. But the other point is also setting, you know, kind of pointing out what is unacceptable, setting the boundaries, because I think one of the problem of what we talked about historical revisionism or so, is that, like, it's not, the lines are so blurred between what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, you know, and I think part of creating a community of a democratic society and an academic debate within a democratic society is both making sure you're heard, but also setting the boundaries of what is beyond that, right? So, you know, I'm not going to sit on a table and discuss with a fascist about the merits of, you know, X, because this is not a debate which is a legitimate debate. And you have to set these boundaries. And I think a lot of problems in many of the societies we're working on, but also broadly, is that these boundaries have become blurred. And because they are both professional historians, like you've mentioned an example from Croatia, who, you know, who are not just historians, but they're also, you know, deeply, you know, at the margins of the democratic political spectrum. And there, as professional, as academics, we also have to set boundaries and say, there are some people with whom we don't want to discuss because we don't think they're legitimate interlocutors, and also communicate this to others. I mean, I always, you know, I have a funny example. It's like I was on a Bosnian television station, and the previous person they talked to was the so-called discoverer of the pyramids of Visoko, who was introduced as an archaeologist, although he's not, you know. And I was telling the journalists, like, you cannot, I mean, first of all, you shouldn't have him on the program, and second of all, he should not be introduced as an archaeologist because he has no degree in archaeology. And she was quite shocked to find out, and she was like, really? But he says he's an archaeologist. Well, you know, there are lots of people who say they're historians, and that doesn't make them. But I think we have to reclaim the space and also tell them, saying, like, no, this is not okay to have this guy in a TV program because he's a charlatan. And I mean, and I think so it's both engagement but also setting our own boundaries, because I think that's, you know, that's what society has to set, these boundaries, and say, no, it's not okay to sell the protocols of the elders of Zion in a bookshop as if it's a normal piece of historical documents. And so I think this has to be reintroduced to some degree, and that's something which, you know, we as historians or scholars can do because we have, you know, we have a certain legitimacy, and we have to insist on that. And I think so it's this mixture of both engagement and boundary setting, which I think is really important.
Add something?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
I think it's a good example to what you're saying, that on our, I don't know, window historians, Maria Schmidt's work is never reviewed in you know, Hungarian popular media, that I'm actually missing from the picture, because, like, a lot of people are asking, you know, me as a historian, like, what do you think is wrong with it? We all know something is wrong, but can you explain what is wrong with the kind of history that she's writing? And yeah, it should be me who writes the review, but I never have the time. But but I think there should be more engagement on you know, how to express discontent to the public and not, so not legitimize certain kind of historical revisionisms through creating a debate, but to explain to people what's wrong with it and how you can tell. So we have a duty to give devices into people's hands to, inspect for themselves what's wrong with certain narratives.
The audience, do you have any last comments or questions? If not, we will end on time, and we thank you once again for being with us today, and hope to see you soon in some other venues and to continue this important discussion.